Hello, welcome back to our little series about creating our first little React app. As you can remember, we have created the following. Let's start the web server again and show what we've got so far. Currently, we have the little store with a header, some games in the store, and we can add new games like this. 2000, we can add it, and we have some states to contain the current list of everything. It contains, let's go back into the code. It contains an ID, name, release year, and an amount of sales. As you can see, the list of games is currently located in the app component, which contains a state called games, which contains the entire games array. We can add stuff and we can do a lot of things now. We have three components here, the header, the list, and the input view. And as you can see, currently we have everything all contained in one file, which is the app.tsx file. And of course, as in every engineering practice, good practices, you never put everything into one file, which is really bad. It's like putting everything in one function, which is also something you do not want to do. So we will start splitting it up, because what we did split it up already into components, but currently it's all located still in one file. So how are we going to fix this? There are several ways of doing this. We could just make several separate files for each component, and we can put it all in the source directory. This is an okay way of doing this. Maybe in the future, if you put everything into the source directory, you do not have any structure components. If you have a big application which contains a lot of components, then it's a bad idea of just putting it in one flat directory, because it will be very, very crowded soon. So once you start growing, that would be a problem. Most of the times you just make a directory called components. This is just the way I do it. This is not something that is set in stone or mandatory. React just lets you do anything you want. I usually make a directory called components, which has a lowercase c. And then for each component, we could just put them in here, but because some components have several files, because this one, for example, the app component has a CSS file, some tests, and the TSX file. Sometimes you have some kind of utility methods that is also bound to the component, which is in a different file. Then you could say there's like 4 or 5 files for each component, which would crowd the entire components directory. What we could do is just make subdirectories under the components. So for example, if we go to our code and we pick header, we say like we make a new header, make a new folder directory called header. I capitalize the letters H because the components also have capital letters in front, and the components directory is small c. So because this is not a component, so we have the header component, and then we can actually make the file. We create a file, header.tsx. So this is the tsx file. We go into the app and we just cut it and move it to the header. Of course, currently, as you can see by the error, it says like this is not a module yet, you're not exporting anything. So we have to export the header, of course. We use the default export. So because this file only exports one component, we can just export the header entirely as a default export, and you can import it like the following. So you can see there's an error that's like header is not found. We can just quick fix this. We can do import header from the module. As you can see on top, it added the header. You can see that it's at this location, the same location as the components, header. So we have a header here in the components directory. We can do the same thing for all the other components. Let's pick the list component. Let's start also creating a directory. List. And we create a list.tsx. And we start copying the list. First of all, we should start moving the interfaces also to a different file because we do not want it all to be in the app.tsx. So what we're also going to do is create a new file. For example, types.ts. Notice that we do not use tsx. This is just a TypeScript file which contains no JSX or no view logic. So we just put it a TS file. And we put the game interface in there. Notice that we're only putting the interface for the game, not the component related interfaces in there. So we will export the game interface. So we have the export, and then we go back to the app, and you can see that this is broken again. We quick fix it again, and we import the game from the modules. As you can see, this is not the same kind of import. This is using the default import, and of course the types can export multiple things. So we're exporting every interface separately. So you can use this notation, which says like get the game export from types. You can put many things there. You can see it usually when you put it like this from React. There's several things that React exports, like the use state or other things. So it exports multiple things, so you can just select which one you want to import. Okay, now we have the game. There's still a lot of things broken, but we'll start moving it. For now, we will use the list. We will copy the list and the list props. We cut it and paste it in here. We do some formatting. We import the game again. And we have the list item, which we also have to create a component directory for. Actually, we're not going to create a component directory for this one. We're just going to put it in the list because the list item actually is so bound with the list that we do not want to change it. It's bound. We just put it in one directory. It just belongs together. The list and the list item just belongs together. For now, we will export default list. And now we're going to make the list item. TSX. We copy the list item also with its properties. Again, we will just paste it in here, do some quick formatting, and we will export default list item. And we also import the game from the interfaces. As you can see, I usually do the formatting because I always keep forgetting the format short key, which I should learn, which is Shift-Alt-F. I usually do Control-Shift-P and then just go format. If I do not know it by heart, it's just Shift-Alt-F on this machine. So actually Shift-Alt-F, no, this is wrong. Shift Control A and Shift Alt F. So if I do this, Shift Alt F, I really need to remember this, so I will try using the shortcut this way. So Shift Alt F, remember it with me, formatting the document. So we have the list item, so now we can import this. We import it from list item, which is that same directory, so we can just use the // notation here. So now we have the list, and we can see that stuff is needed to be, we can fix this. Just also control dot, we can auto fix this. As you can see, it was added here, which is a default import because list is exported default. So for now, we have everything working again. We still have another component, which is the input view. we do the input view. We make the input view.tsx, and we start moving this also. You must be wondering why I start moving everything only just now. I could have done this way in the beginning, but what I usually like to do is create everything in just one file. Usually I just start with using the app component and then work everything out, or a lot of things out, and then I start subdividing it into smaller components. When everything is settled, if I know, okay, this is a structure I will be using, I will usually start moving it to separate directories only then, because sometimes you just, well, you say, oh, this component might be splitted up also, and I didn't think this one through. Then you can avoid this by just creating your structure first and then only dividing it into several folders, because if you have to change it, you will have to do a lot of refactoring, and we do not want to do that. Now I just create the app. In the app component, I usually split it up there and then start making directories only then. But we will continue our quest to continue importing stuff. We're importing the use state, which we use here, and the game from the types. We need to export this. Again, default, input view. We do not export the interface because it's bound to the input view, so we get it for free. And then we import this, and then like this. And normally, there's still something wrong here. Cannot find the name. Okay, it's actually did go. Okay, see, everything is working again. Everything works. 2001. And everything is added again. So now we have split up the components. There's also one thing that is really nice. I will not do it entirely, but if you go to the tsconfig and you go all below and you put it in the compiler options and you put base URL, you say src, so for source, you say the base URL for imports is source. The main advantage what we can do is get rid of all these annoying relative imports. Now we're at the location of components, input view, and we have to reference the types. Then we have to know what position we are in the directory structure, and we do not want that. We just want to enter absolute paths, and we can do that now because we said like the base URL is src, so every import can be done relative to the base URL. So we can actually just say we import game from types. This will usually result into some crashes, so we have to start it again. And everything keeps working, and we can just import it like this from types. We can do another example. For example, if we want to, let's see the input view. No, let's use the list item. We can also use types. For example, if we do not want to reference it by this, we can do components list, and then it's relative to the base URL. And this also, we can change it to this. And the types is correct. This is also correct. And then actually what we're going to do is create a separate directory for the app. And this is actually the reason why we're doing this. We can just move several files related to the main app component. We can put it in here. Yes, we want to move this, and then several things will be broken. And then actually we will just use the relative, the absolute imports, and then it's easily fixed. And then we can actually move around this class whatever we want, because this will always stay the same. Now we have the app, then we have to fix something. This is something we need to fix. we still need to use the components. We need to fix the import here, components, app, not app. I think everything will be working again now. As you can see, everything works. Everything works. So we have refactored our app to use absolute imports. We have created an entire structure for our components, so they're organized neatly. And if you need something, you know what directory to look in. There's not a lot of clutter of files, and it's a bit future-proof. So now we have done the structuring of the app, and now we will just start looking at the styling of the apps. Let's start looking into styling. There's actually a lot of ways of styling your application. This is usually very subjective. It's biased. A lot of people are saying we want to do it this way, and the other one saying that way. As you know, the React community can be very vocal about stuff, and maybe I'm not doing it entirely what the other group wants, but I will be using CSS modules mainly in this version. There are other ways of doing it. I will discuss them very briefly, but we will be mainly using CSS modules. First of all, what is a CSS module? We have to start from the beginning. We have the app component. The app component contains a CSS file, and it is imported like this. What we're going to do, we're going to create a new class. And I must say in advance that I'm not a CSS expert. So bear with me if I make some mistakes or some weird choices here. But I will create a class container which has some padding 10 pixels. I will be looking at this one and I will say like class. And do notice I'm doing something wrong here. I know that I'm doing something wrong, but I will do it like this, and it will say, oh, this is not possible. Div does not have a property named class, which is usually how we do it in HTML CSS. This is not the way we do it in React, because there's something complaining here. It says it clashes with the class keyword from JavaScript. We do not want to use class. What we use is class name. So this is a disadvantage. If you start copying some HTML and CSS from the internet, you will have to change every class into class name, which is quite annoying. I think I've read somewhere they were trying or going to fix this, that it's also possible to use class, but for now I'm not sure. So let's keep using class name because for now this is not supported otherwise. So we just use class name. Now we have used the container, and then we can see if I put the React app that we have some padding here. And now I'm going to show you why we have to use CSS modules, because this works. We can just use the CSS and it kind of works here. Okay. So what are we going to do? We're just going to do the header, and we're going to create a new CSS file. So we have the CSS file, and we also make class container. And we say like background color red. We're going to say this huge background color. This huge header will have a background color, and it will be red. And I will import it like before. Import header.css. And I will say like class name container. And if we go to our code, you can see something, well, not really weird going on, but something we really expect, that everything is red, not just the header. Every div or every element that has the container class will be red, because it is not a module. It's not because you say like import header that is only present here. It will be merged together. And that's the problem here. We want our components and their CSS to be very modular so that they do not interfere with each other. How are we gonna do that? Well, we could just say, okay, just keep to a naming convention that every header should have a class name that contains the name of the component, but this is not feasible to maintain. Not all teams will follow this guideline. So there's actually a way of handling this the correct way, and this is using CSS modules, which I like very much. What we're actually going to do is just rename the CSS. We're going to rename. And we're going to say header module CSS. And also with this one, app dot module.css. There's actually a different way of importing it right now. We say import styles from, and of course we do module.css. We're actually using styles, and we do the same here. Styles, we actually import a styles object like it was exported from this component. Of course, we add module, and then instead of using a string here, we can actually use and this is something you can look at. You can download the extension, which is like CSS modules. You search for it, and you take this one, you install it, then you have some nice auto-completion for the CSS modules. I have it installed already, so I will not be doing this. But let's see. Actually, instead of using a string here, we can just use the curly braces for the expression. I will do styles.container. Like this, it will use the container from the styles object. And I will do exactly the same thing for the app component. And instead of using the container, I will be using, well, I had copied entirely. So it's actually importing it from this module, which has the result that if we go back into the example website, you can see that only the header has the CSS class assigned to it. It has the red background. If we go into the developer tools, go to element, and we go into the hierarchy where the header is here, and you can see that it actually does not use the container class, but it actually generates something random. First, of course, like I suggested, it uses the component name, underscore, the name of the class, and then some random ID to separate it from the other class. If I go here, let's see, where did I put it? Like this, the app underscore container and the different one. These are the same containers, the same classes with the same name, but it generates a random one, so it does not clash. So now our components are neatly packed together, no outside interference, no other class, no other CSS can actually influence your current module. So this is a nice way of doing this. This is the CSS modules, a way of doing it. Let's start styling this one up a little bit more. So we will be using the header modules, and we will be doing something which I can only describe as a very ugly layouting, but I will just do it. I will make a header class, and then we'll use a font size, which is like 22 points, and we will be using border bottom. We'll have a nice border on the bottom. We will use a solid black one, and we will use text transform to make it uppercase. Now we will use the correct one. We will use header, and then I can show you what it looks like. As you can see, it's not a very nice yet, but okay, we have some nice border on, so we will be using that one. And then we will start looking into the input view, which does not have a CSS module yet. We will use input view module.css. And we will be making an input view class which contains a margin, which is like 10 pixels. I'm just copying this from my notes here because I'm not that fast in CSS, so I will be copying it from my notes. It will be a column. It is flexbox layout. It will be using a column, which is a vertical way of orienting our elements. And I will use the input, and I will say it will be 500 pixels and a margin of 5 pixels. And box sizing will be a border box. Now we will use the styles, which is actually like this. We will use class name again. Oh, it generated some funky stuff. Styles, and I have not imported it yet, so I will import styles from input view.css. Of course, I'm always forgetting the module part. And then we can use styles. And we will use the input view. And then we probably have some nice, as you can see, we put some CSS on the form as well, which is again very, very ugly. And for our list, we will also be creating a CSS, but we'll just create one file because they always stick together, the list and the list item. I could have put them into one file, but I did not do that, but I could have done that. So let's continue. We want to style our list. We create a games list. Also display flex. I'm usually, you can do it different ways, but I like to use flex because of my React Native background, and it's flex everywhere, so I'm really used to using flex. Like I said, I'm not a CSS guru. I will be using flex is row, flex direction is a row, using, and flex wrap is wrap. So actually what we're going to do is put the little games into small squares that are oriented horizontally. So that's why we're using the flex direction row. We use flex wrap because if the elements, well, if there's too many elements, it should go to the next line. This is actually the game card, what I was talking about. We'll create a border, which is 1 pixel. We will use padding, which is 10 pixels, a width of 200 pixels, box shadow, like a nice little shadow, which I will just copy the rest of this stuff. This is not rocket science, and I will try to format this. So we just put a shadow in there, some nice background. We have border, radius, and some margins. What we're gonna do is use the list, and we will use class, of course, class name, and we import the styles from list module.css, and we will use styles. We will use the games list style here, and we will copy this into the list item, and we will also style our little cards here. Class name, remember to use class name, and we will use the game card. We save it, and then let's see what it looks like. As you can see, it looks a little bit more clean now. It's nothing special, but you can see every element is styled currently the way I want. So I was saying before that there are multiple ways of handling styling, and there's actually another one than CSS modules, which basically does the same thing, but actually we define our CSS in JavaScript itself. It looks a little bit weird because you're not using the same CSS names as in the CSS, because you cannot use I will just show it. For an example, we can actually remove this and say, let's use it in like inline styles yet. This is not the way you usually want to do this, but it's just for an example. What we can do is like font size, and you can see that it's not the same. If you look at the module, it's like font, it's a little thing here, and size. And here we have it in camel case. So it's not the same. We use 22 dot border bottom, and we can actually just copy this, and you can see that it will actually remain the same, but it looks differently. Yeah? Uppercase, and as you can see, it still looks the same. So we actually defined our style as a JavaScript object, which contains some properties. And of course, that is the reason why it's written like this, because we cannot use several things like, let's see, we cannot use this, and that is why it is written like this. Because if we would do it like this, it will say this is not possible, because it will think that we're actually using font minus size, which is not the case. We do it like this. So this is not really the way you want to do it. Actually, what you want to do is create a little object to contain it, so you do not have to use inner inline styles, which is actually we create a header style. We give it the type CSS properties. And what we're gonna do is just move this into this. We're gonna remove these. We're gonna do some auto formatting, and we can actually use the styles here. We just put it here, and then we have the styles in a separate object, and then we have it neatly done like this. See, it works like this, so it still works. So now we've seen how to use some styling in JavaScript itself, which is actually the way it's done most of the time in React Native. But usually I've seen a lot of developers use just regular CSS. Why? Because animations, for example, are way easier to do in just plain CSS. There's several disadvantages of using JavaScript way of working, but there is a way of just working around this, and this is actually using a little package named styled components, which we're gonna install. And this might go wrong. I haven't prepared this yet, but if we install styled components, and we're also going to install the types for this package, because we're going, well, we're doing this in TypeScript, so we should also install the types. So what we can do now, using the styled components, if we have installed it, yes, we will go into our header, and instead of using it like this, we will now import styled from styled components. And what we can do now is create a new title header, and we'll say like styled, and then we say, well, this is a div, and we put the backticks here, which is a little bit weird, but it's the way it works. And then we can actually use our regular CSS in here. Like I said, it looks a little bit weird and it's hard to get used to, but once you're used to this, you will like it. So this is just regular CSS we put in here. We can just put this away, and then instead of using an H1, we can actually use this as like this is a separate component. So we can actually use this, which will be like a div. And now we can restart our application. So actually this creates a styled div with this CSS. And as you can see, it will look exactly the same. And I think I've made a mistake, and I might, let's see if I can fix this, because I say this is like a div, but it was actually h1. So like this, now it looks like an h1, and it's no longer a div, because the original was not a div. So we can actually say styled and then the name of the element, which is like an h1 here, which could have been a div or anything else. And then you just give the style that is that you want to use for this this component. So now we have created this, and actually, like I said, it makes it also possible to have some animations. So we can actually put animation. I will say like 1 second. We will use fade in, and like this one, like this is using the backtick notation. You can actually use the dollar parenthesis fade in, which actually references to an animation. We could say like const fade in keyframes, and we can use the backtick again, and we have to import keyframes from styled components, keyframes, and then I can use the keyframes. I will say like 0%. So in the beginning, it will has the opacity of 0. And then we will use 100%, which will have the opacity of 1. So it actually will fade in and ease out. So normally, if I refresh the application now, you can see the fade in going smoothly. So now we can actually use our CSS in our JavaScript files, which is a nice way of doing without using the CSS modules, and also having the advantages of everything that is in CSS. And this will actually compile into, well, not compile, but this will actually be transformed into actual CSS. So you can use anything you want. You can just use the normal way of writing your properties, not like before that you had to use the camel case where the size would be big and this would be gone. And we can use animations. So this is actually the best of both worlds, but then you would need to use an external library, which is styled components, which is used a lot around. So it's actually a very nice library, which I would suggest that you use. Now, what we need to do is see one. Yeah, let's see if we still have some time for this. Yeah, let's continue on side effects because we still have some time. Let's look at a relatively, maybe a little bit complicated topic. It's actually a side effect. What is a side effect? Sometimes we just want our components to do something that is not in the responsibility of the component. Actually, a component should only render the UI. Its main responsibility should be rendering the UI. But sometimes components should actually do some different stuff that is actually causing a ripple into the world outside. Like, for example, setting a document title, or if you're using a set interval, which is not really affecting how the component is rendered, but it does something in the future. Or for example, where side effects are used a lot is actually when you're doing API calls. If you're reading data or writing data to external web services, this is actually something we would call a side effect. This is something that happens into the outside world, which is outside the component. The component's only responsibility is to render a view. So if you do something that is not related to that, then it should be done in a side effect. Let's just start with an example of using side effects. For example, like I said, something outside of the scope of your component. For example, if I will open the web page again. If, for example, we want everything that we type in here, we want it to be stored in our local storage because we want to remember what the last time when we were here was entered in here. If we entered something here, it should pop up again when we revisit this page. We want to do something in the local storage. This is actually not something that is related to rendering, so this is a side effect. You could do it without a side effect. Let's do this at first. Let's just go to the input view. And then we will go to the handle change, name change. And then instead of setting the name, which is related to this component, we will actually say like local storage, set item. We will use a name, and we will just store the name into our local storage. So now we stored it into local storage, as I can show you. Type, and let's see in our developer tools, if we go into application, go to local storage, as you can see, if I start typing it in here, you can see it being saved in our local storage. So this actually works, but this is not the way we want it to be because this is not clean. We're actually doing stuff that is outside the scope of our component, so we have to put it in an effect. So what is an effect? But first I will implement the reading of this this local storage. What we can actually do is we can put this in the default value. We can just use local storage, and we say get item, and we will say name, and we will use this. I will explain what this is. So we will look it up in our local storage. We'll say like, give me the item which has the key name. If this is undefined or empty, it will use this, and it will say, okay, this is the value we want to use if this is empty. This is actually the double question mark is actually saying, if this is undefined, use this as a value. Let's see that this works. I type, and if I refresh the page, as you can see, it is in here. It used it out of the local storage. I can refresh whenever I want. I stored it on local storage, and I read it into our state when I am creating our component. So let's try rewriting this with an effect. What is an effect? We can use effect, and we can add a callback handler here. And the second argument is the dependencies. What is this dependencies thing? Actually, what we want to do is every time the name is set, we want to trigger this effect that the name will be saved into our local storage, that we can take this outside. We just do not want it here. And we say, well, instead of this one, we will use name. So this is the dependency. So what is this dependent on? It's actually dependent on the name. Every time the name changes, this function will trigger and save the item in the local storage. So now it's saved. And there's different ways of using this effect. This is actually using the dependence. There's also a way of just triggering something when the component is mounted, which we use the empty dependencies. So you can run code, listen very carefully. I will say this only once. So this will be triggered only when the component is mounted in the beginning So I can show this. If I go like this, we use a control. Let's see, this is only done right only once. I can even re-render everything, but this will only be triggered once. This is because we put the empty dependencies here. And this is actually something that is done a lot for when you are just getting data from an API when a component mounts. So before we had class components, and class components was the way we were doing this in React before we were using function components. Then you had some lifecycle methods like component did mount, and then we put our API calls there because this way it looked very very nice. But when we used function components, this feature actually disappeared a little bit, so we had to use effects. And this is actually what is very it's very related to the component did mount. It's actually doing almost exactly the same thing. When your component is mounted, this function will be called because we used the empty dependencies here. So what can we do with it? We can actually do some API logic in here if you use a fetch thing and we have blah, blah, blah. Let's not do it right now. But if you want to do fetch when your component is mounted, then you use the use effect, you give the callback, you do the fetching here, and you just give an empty dependency, so it's triggered only once. If you just add no dependencies, it will be triggered every re-render. I can show this. As you can see, as you can see, this component is re-rendered every time, and every time it is re-rendered, this code will launch. So this is not used a lot, but it can be used if you just leave out the dependencies. If you put the dependencies back, it will only be done once when the component mounts. Just remove this. Like I said before, another way of setting, for another example, is like setting the title, which you usually want to do only once. So you just use effect, and you add the dependencies, and then you do document title games store. I actually should be using single quotes because I'm just using everything mixed together. So if I just go back into our little app, as you can see, the title was changed to game store when the component was mounted. So now we've done some major refactoring. We've split up our components. We've created a nice directory structure out of it. We've looked into styling. We've looked into CSS modules. We've looked into inline styling. We've looked into styled components, which is a very nice way of working. So I advise that either you use CSS modules or styled components if you are not afraid of using an external library for this. And then we looked into side effects a little bit. And next up, we will be looking at routers and pages, but this is for our next little session. So I hope you enjoyed yourself. I hope you learned a little bit. And we'll see each other next time.